Unfortunately, Sophus couldn't be here today, so it'll be me and Sophus in me. Okay, so it's a soldier, a scholar, competing masculinities in the representations of Ashurbanipal. If we were presenting this paper a few years ago, we might have started with a polemic to lament the dearth of gender studies in our field. Given that this is the third gender methodology at the Ancient Near East workshop, this lament is luckily no longer necessary. We have been quick to address this gap and seem to be faring much better, not only with the broadening of theoretical perspectives, but also with novel methodological applications to make sense of our data. It seems to us that what is emerging from our field is a toolkit of context-specific methodologies that can speak to the whole of the Ancient Near East, as well as to projects outside our field proper. For astrology, Egyptology, archaeology, and many other ologies, gender theories no longer make claims to novelty. Mario Liverani gets on with Foucault, and Butler is very at home with Bahrani in Babylon. But to what extent can these theoretical entanglements, or to what extent have these theoretical entanglements been useful to make sense of the sources available to us? They have certainly allowed a number of us to work very productively at initiating discussions on the way we do gender in our field. And they have certainly helped us, Sophus and myself, to begin to ask questions of the Neo-Assyrian sources in order to make some sense of the role played by gender in the imperial imaginary. Today, I am here to share our preliminary results of a work in progress on the masculinities of Ashurbanipal. We have been looking at the modalities of masculinities for the late Neo-Assyrian period, and we have focused on the longue durée of the construction of masculinities, as well as the innovations specific to the reign of Ashurbanipal. We will first present how the text and visual arts construct masculinities, and then we will map the way Ashurbanipal fits within this gendered longue durée. As our title suggests, Ashurbanipal's innovations take place precisely at the intersection of two discursive modes, the soldierly construct and its scholarly counterpart. In order to make sense of the claims to masculinity made by Neo-Assyrian rulers in general, and by Ashurbanipal in the present paper, we will also need to make some theoretical detours to frame our own entanglement with the source materials. To begin with, we have been looking at masculinities as heuristic categories. As Gail Bademan instructs, without a clear definition of what we mean by masculinities, we would slip on the skin of tautology and end up seeing masculinity in every single occurrence emanating from the body's normally or normatively identified male. It is not that the emic context does not allow for this strategy. For the ancient Assyrians, the male body was indeed the site upon which masculinities was painted in broad strokes. However, the male body does not always perform masculinity, nor are masculinities solely reserved for men. For the purposes of the present workshop, we will focus on the construction of royal masculinities, that is, those hegemonic ideals required for legitimate kingship. Jack Halberstram and Paul Beatriz Preciado provide a good lens through which we can escape the circularity of reasoning. For both theorists of gender, masculinities are discursive practices, usually, but not necessarily, mapped onto the male body. They are not acts or articulations that emanate solely or exclusively from the bio body, but they are inscribed onto the body to appear to naturally emerge from it. This bodily fiction, called gender, is entirely reliant on what Halverson calls a set of prosthetics, which we would like to view in light of Lambros Malaforis' philosophy of material engagement, as an entanglement between bodies and things in which the mental system extends the limits of the body to the outer edges of the material with which the body becomes entangled. The material aspect of the construction of masculinity is a useful tool for the astrologist and the art historian, because they help us make sense, among other things, of the prosthetics and the gender of kingship. To begin to see how prosthetics work in the construction of ideal royal masculinity, it is best to start with the creation of the royal body, especially of the Neo-Assyrian king. The sovereign soma is incomplete until the prosthetics of masculinity are grafted onto it. Ashurbanipal's coronation ritual shows these bodily prosthetics being conferred onto the king by the 5 gods, all of them male. Anu gave his crown, Ilin gave his throne, Ninurta gave his weapon, Nergal gave his luminous splendor, Nusku sent and placed advisors before him. Unlike the Neo-Babylonian account of the creation of king, in the Neo-Assyrian, in this specific Neo-Assyrian coronation hymn, the female deity does not feature as the agency behind the sovereign's physical allure. Ashurbanipal's prosthetic completion is an all-male, homosocial event in which his body is extended with materiality and therefore technologized. The crown, the throne, and the weapons, the rated splendor, and the complicit males all bolster the king's hegemonic mode of masculinity. These body parts underscore the king's ability to emasculate and subordinate others in the domain of martial masculinity. Such prosthetics also place the king in relation to mortal males. The Neo-Assyrian king relies on the agency of these material extensions for his martial valor. In the visual expressions of the masculinity of kingship, the royal body is also prostheticized through a luxuriant beard that, as in the case of the victory stela of Esarhaddon from Zincirli, is emphasized to a degree which is remarkable when compared to that of the supplicants on the same monument. Embodied, accessorized and dressed, the Neo-Assyrian king's body became, through these prosthetics, a technologized subjectivity in a martial homosociality. The prostheticized body of the sovereign is further extended to any materiality that stands in for the sovereign, that is, the inscriptions, the reliefs, and the palaces themselves. Indeed, as Paul Garelli has already noted, Neo-Assyrian royal discourse uses the same terminology to describe the allure emanating from the royal palace as that which emanates from the king's body itself. Just as the king's masculine body is extended through words and splendor, so is it expanded through the entire palace, including its inscriptions and reliefs. Body and palace are intertwined in the construction of the king's gender. One was a stand-in for the other. One was the other. This shared ontology collapses the distinction between the body of the king, the body politic, and the prosthetics of kingship. In the Neo-Assyrian imperial discourse, material engagement and gender thus intersect in all the media employed by the state to visualize and textualize imperial sovereignty. The nexus of this intersection occurs precisely where the divinely gifted body meets its material extensions. The royal inscriptions, for example, appear to make no distinction between the bow, arrow, and the sovereign at times. Although the narrative is owned by the sovereign, the agency behind the vanquishing of the enemy is at times passed on to the bow or the arrow, which are said to subdue and slay the enemy as independent entities. This oscillation between the sovereign and the bow-arrow produces a masculine agency which remains undifferentiated. In fact, it seems to collapse the boundary between the sovereign and the accessory. Without the bow and arrow, the king's body is incomplete, and the divine command to expand the land would not be possible. The visual repertoire likewise blurs the edges between the physical body of the ruler and the parameters of the body politic. Ashurbanipal's lion hunts are not only a visual spectacle of his bow prowess, but also a static picture of the complete image of an imperial rule as such: king, dress, accessory, chariots, horses. The bow participates in the construction of the king's masculine identity as a warrior and an intermediate between the divine and the mortal spheres. And as such, the prosthetic extension is what accomplishes the required exercise of kingship. The total agency of the technologized subjectivity as king acts as an intermediary that channels the very masculinity of kingship through body and prosthetic as one. It is the ascribed masculinity of these bodies and body parts that all taken together constitute kingship. The claim of military excellence lies at the base of the representation of Neo-Assyrian leadership. But what about the stylus that appears in the very late Neo-Assyrian iconography of rule, in which Natalie May has studied very, very closely with regards to the claim made by Ashurbanipal for his scholarship and basing it on Shulgi's work. What about the stylus that appears in the very late Neo-Assyrian iconography of rule? In the reign of Ashurbanipal, a new ethos of royal masculinity appears on the horizon, that of the scholar whose material manifestations emerge in the library and the stylus itself. The prestige of the scholarly construct could perhaps be best pointed out with the material entanglement of the stylus to Ashurbanipal's body, while the king is not engaged in direct scholarly activity, implying, therefore, that Ashurbanipal's identity had to perform this ethos at all times. In one of Horace's words, it was an active strategy of value acquisition, of creating stratification within a seemingly fossilized class, that is, kingship. In the spectacular lion hunts, Ashurbanipal's portrait of the king goes through an innovation otherwise absent from the history of Assyrian visual culture. In the iconic image of Ashurbanipal as lion hunter, the king is dressed in a rosette-studded garment, and wedged into his belt is a stylus used for writing cuneiform. The image of the scholar king at the lion hunt, with a dagger at his left side and a stylus at his right, is an iconographic instantiation of the textual reference of the claim to scholarship in his Prism B inscription, and I quote, "The great gods in their assembly determined a favourable destiny as my lot. They granted me a broad mind, and allowed me to learn, and allowed my mind to learn all the scribal arts. They glorified the mention of my name in the assembly of princes, and made my kingship great." Like the bow, the stylus is complicit in the creation of the body of the sovereign, although it seems to be out of place as a redundant accessory for the hunt. Evidently, rather than a redundant body part, the stylus is part of the identity of the king, even while he promotes the metonymic image of Neo-Assyrian masculine kingship. The king is always already a scholar, above all else, even when fulfilling the ritual slaying of lions to appease the goddess's hunger for the sacrificial victims. That the stylus is complicit in the construction of masculinity is perhaps also seen in the alignment of the beard and stylus in most of the compositions of the lion hunt. Ashurbanipal, equipped with all these prosthetic parts, body parts, shows off his learning and his prowess. He is therefore not using a new weapon, but he is extending and transforming his very self. He is therefore not the same hunter as, say, Ashurbanipal II before him. Representational content, identity and gender are therefore not to be found in his head, but rather in the negotiation between person and object. His agency has to be understood, therefore, as partially determined by the affordance of scholarly abilities and by the implement itself. They determine his situational perspective, and they give his being in the world. But how can we explain the appearance of this new prosthetic object and this mode of masculinity as scholarship, which so dramatically altered not only the visual and textual presentation of the king, but also his gendered identity and his very being in the world? To understand why this change took place, we must return to the connection between the king's body and the empire's body politic. The depiction of the Neo-Assyrian king as a muscular, aggressive, virile, and victorious person, in turn, depicted the state as metonymically strong, militaristic, productive, and successful. The king thus came to embody the positive attributes that the audience was invited to associate with the state, though this was a rather special kind of embodiment. The king's masculine body was created through a distributed and prosthetic presence across a number of material media, and this body, in turn, formed the background for a congregation of positive signs that represented the well-being of the empire more broadly. However, the reign of Ashurbanipal saw a decisive shift in the structure of this metonymic relation. Among the various positive attributes that were associated with the king's body, one in particular was aggrandized, to the point that it subsumed all the others: safety. In Ashurbanipal's reliefs and inscriptions, one sees an unprecedented emphasis on the safety of the king's body, which is to be secured in every imaginable way. Though the exact dynamics of cultural change are always hard to pin down precisely, there were certainly good historical reasons at the time for an emphasis on safety. Ashurbanipal's three predecessors on the throne had all died under dramatic circumstances, and this was followed by political instability. Against such stark precedence, keeping the king alive must have been an important priority. In other words, the king's care of the self became an affair of the state, and one of enormous importance, correlated with keeping state power smoothly functional. This development accounts for a number of striking innovations in his reign. One of the most striking examples of the emphasis on safety is the removal of the king's body from the battlefield in practically all the royal inscriptions. In the earliest preserved version of Ashurbanipal's accounts of his military campaigns from the 3rd or 4th regnal year, the king is not portrayed as being directly involved in the campaigns against Egypt or Kurbit. Instead, the army is led by unnamed eunuchs and governors, and credit for the eventual success goes to the army itself, while the role of the king is to receive the happy news in Nineveh and decide the fate of the captive enemies. The next preserved account of Ashurbanipal's campaign dates to much later, around the 20th year on his throne. Here, the early episodes have been revised to show Ashurbanipal being personally present in Egypt and Kurbit, but even here, there is an emphasis on the king's absence from the battlefield, and that absence is now provided with ideological justification. As he receives news of the Oman's revolt in Elam, Ashurbanipal prays for support from the goddess Ishtar. The reply arrives in the form of a dream, where Ishtar tells Ashurbanipal to remain in his palace while she herself wages war against Omar. You will stay where you are, eat food, drink beer, have music played, worship my divinity. Meanwhile, I will go and carry out this task, ensuring that you achieve your heart's desire. Your face will not pale, nor will your feet tremble. You will not have to wipe off sweat in the heat of battle. Ashurbanipal's passivity in the war against Elam is here portrayed as divinely decreed. He stays in Nineveh out of piety, not cowardice. In particular, Ishtar's speech counterpoises physical exertion and the danger of battle with physical pleasure and sensual enjoyment. To eat, drink, listen to music is exactly the complete opposite of military danger. Crucially, however, Ashurbanipal is still giving credit for the eventual success of the army. Masculinity at work once again. So therefore the topos of surplus enjoyment, surplus jouissance in Lacanian terms, which serves to glean masculine dividend through refraction. It may be argued that this shift in the reliefs and inscriptions reflects an actual change in military practice during Ashurbanipal's reign, whereby professional generals acquired a more central role in the leadership of the army. But the very fact that the king's absence from the battlefield is not concealed, but actually trumpeted and justified in state rhetoric, is quite revealing. The king's military passivity was no longer a matter of shame, but a crucial ideological message in its own right. Indeed, one might just as well conclude that the shift in military practice, if there was actually one, was the result of a shift in state ideology, rather than the other way around. The ideological significance of the king's safety had completely eclipsed that of his martial prowess. Indeed, it is not that scholarly, aggressive, or muscular displays of masculinity ceased to be important under Ashurbanipal. Rather, they were transposed to the realm of hunting. The king demonstrates his physical virility in combat with lions, rather than with other human beings. The key difference between the two is that the lion hunts, unlike the battle scenes, could be carefully managed and choreographed. By freely displaying the theatricality of the hunt, the reliefs create a space for the king to exercise the full force of his virile masculinity, while also being, at all times, perfectly safe. One of the most significant results of the new emphasis on safety during Ashurbanipal's reign is what may be termed the invention of intimacy in Neo-Assyrian royal art. The reliefs and literary compositions associated with Ashurbanipal depict the king with a degree of personal intimacy that is unparalleled in the ancient Near East, and certainly in the Neo-Assyrian sequence. The reliefs and inscriptions of previous Assyrian kings focus almost exclusively on the presence in the public sphere. They are engaged in campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, religious ceremonies, and building projects. With Ashurbanipal, however, the king is also shown engaged in activities that have nothing to do with his public persona, activities which by their very nature involve his seclusion to a private sphere. For example, in the famous banquet scene, From Ashurbanipal's North Palace, the king is shown reclining on a couch, drinking and enjoying the company of his queen, Balishara, while attendants bring food, play music, and fan the royal couplet. Crucially, these are activities that Ashurbanipal was told to carry out by Ishtar in the speech we quoted slightly above, and which was set up as the polar opposite of military danger. Ashurbanipal's sensuous pleasure in the company of his queen in the orchard, which is the most heavily eroticized locale in cuneiform cultures, is not just a further addition to the usual repertoire of royal art. It is presented as a stark contrast to the previous emphasis on war. The intimate sphere is thereby presented as the most consummately danger-free zone. Surrounded by trees, servants, and bodily pleasure, the king is placed at the furthest possible remove from bodily threats. Ashurbanipal is thus shown not only out of danger, but in one place where previous representations of royal power had never been able to show the king, in private. While the lion hunt reliefs take care to display the king's safety, they still depict a very public affair, an event that would have been visible to even ordinary citizens. Not so with the banquet scene, which gave Ashurbanipal's subject a glimpse of a world they had no other way of accessing. The king's intimate and sensuous company with his queen and a few select servants. We are shown a pictorial representation of something that we are not meant to see in actual reality. Indeed, this is the entire point of the scene, to publicly display the king as utterly removed from danger, including the dangers that are involved in public displays. The rising importance of safety as an ideal of kingship under Ashurbanipal thus led to a remarkable artistic innovation, the creation of an intimate sphere producing a visual sense of seclusion and bodily pleasure that is presented, yet ultimately also inaccessible to the audience of the reliefs. As such, it is a very particular kind of intimacy, one that both hides the king from the public sphere and displays his private life for all of us to see, or at least for those who had access to the royal palace. In the words of Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick, Ashurbanipal is shown in private in public. Privacy itself becomes a public performance. Finally, however, this apparent contradiction is in fact just a particularly clear example of the structure of royal gender more broadly. As argued above, the king's masculinity occupies a curious ontological position, since it was at one and the same time tied to the king's body and spread out across the totality of its representations. Royal masculinity cleaved to the king's physical presence, but also constructed through a prosthetic palace, an imperial aggregation that included reliefs, inscriptions, and scripted public performances. In turn, this constructed gender was read through an ideological metonymy that made the king's body a semiotic substitute for the well-being of the entire state. Ashurbanipal's intimacy connoted a serious safety. In other words, for Ashurbanipal, the person could not be anything but political, because the personal was both constructed by and a sign of the political apparatus as a whole. The state made his masculinity intimate, and in turn made his masculinity a symbol for itself. Thank you.